It's my great pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Matthew Wynia. Matt is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado. His career has included developing a research institute and training programs focusing on bioethics, professionalism, and policy issues. You might have heard of a little shop he started called the AMA Institute for Ethics. And he's also founded the AMA Center for Patient Safety. His research has focused on novel uses of survey data to inform and improve the practical management of ethical issues in healthcare and public policy. He's led projects on a wide variety of topics related to ethics and professionalism, including understanding and measuring the ethical climate of healthcare organizations and systems, ethics and quality improvement, communication, team-based care, and engaging patients as members of the team, defining physician professionalism, public health and disaster ethics, medicine and the Holocaust with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and inequities in health and healthcare. That's just a short list. He has served on committees, expert panels, and a reviewer for the Institute of Medicine, the Joint Commission, the Hastings Center, the American Board of Medical Specialties, federal agencies, and other organizations. He's a past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and has chaired the Ethics Forum of the American Public Health Association and the Ethics Committee of the Society for General Internal Medicine. Thank you so much, Matt, for your work in making today possible, and we look forward to hearing you talk about the short history and tenuous future of medical professionalism. Please join me in welcoming Matt.
So thank you so much, Becca, and thank you to the staff, especially of the Harvard Center for Bioethics. This is a great pleasure and an honor. I have been told I have to stand right here, just in case you in the room are wondering. I normally sort of wander around, but the camera's right there. So I'm in this corner, whether you like it or not. This is where I am. Whether I like it or not, this is where I am. So I'm going to speak today about the short history and the tenuous future. I think maybe none of you would question the tenuous future part of this, but the short history. This is the idea that the practice of medicine is a profession in the modern sense of that word, at least, is much shorter than I think many people realize. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of that history. And Becca has already alluded to this in her earlier comments, this sort of evolution of our understanding of the ethics of the medical profession from being one oriented around individuals and around personal oaths to the concept of having a shared code of ethics that governs the behavior, the practice standards, the training standards. All of those things are much younger than you might imagine. That gets to the question of, so what do we mean when we talk about professionalism? What does that word actually mean? And I'll spend just a couple minutes on that sort of in the middle of the talk, and then we'll move forward with, again, some of the things that Becca's already alluded to and that will not be as shocking to you, but I hope framing them in this sort of historical context will be useful. So the emergence of professionalism, and again, this is something where you might imagine that professionalism in medicine originated with Hippocrates, which is a long, long time ago, right? That's not a short history, that's a very long history. And it is true that the Hippocratic school of medical practitioners was a very influential school eventually. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, has said that Hippocrates was the first to really combine the scientific promises and the ethical promises of the medical profession. Prior to the Hippocratic era, medicine or the practice of herbs and treatments of various kinds was sort of recognized as a skill set. But it was a skill set that you could basically hire someone to do. So the difference between a sorcerer and a healer was not really defined, right? You could hire the doctor to help. You could also hire a doctor to kill someone. because they have the skills to poison people, right? So this injunction of the Hippocratics to refrain from the intentional harm of patients was a key development in medical ethics 2,000 years ago. Hippocrates also, by the way, very important for transitioning medicine from an oral history tradition to a written history tradition. If you're interested in the history of quality improvement in medicine, that of course is a very important thing, because you can remember a lot more if you're writing it down than you can if you're passing it on in stories. And the other piece of this that I really like to emphasize, because it's going to come back to haunt us later, humility. Humility in medical practice is the central virtue in the Hippocratic corpus. And I'll just give you maybe the most famous quote about this. Life is short, the art is long. Experiment treacherous, judgment difficult. And by the way, the Greek for experiment is the word experimentum, which I'm told does not just mean like a research experiment. Any treatment is an experimentum. Every time you do something, it's an experimentum, right, for that person. So the idea that this is difficult work, it requires continuous improvement, and it's something about which you must be humble in your practice at the individual level, all critically important in terms of the evolution of what we now call the medical profession. The question is, was there professionalism in the Hippocratic era? And as I said, Margaret Mead said there had not yet been this distinction. All of these important things came about. And yet Al Johnson, the famous historian of medicine and medical ethics, says in the Hippocratic times, there does not appear to have been anything like a medical profession. Why would he say that? Well, he would say that because the Hippocratics were a tiny little sect. They weren't the entirety of medical practitioners. They were a little group, right? And there's argument even about how influential they were in their own time. They become influential, you know, generations and generations later, they become very influential. In fact, there's a sort of moment around the Nuremberg medical trial where there's an explicit decision made to say the origins of medical ethics lie in the Hippocratic Oath, which, you know, none of the doctors on trial at Nuremberg ever swore the Hippocratic Oath. That was not a thing that happened during medical training in that era. But the prosecutors wanted to say there is a long history of adherence to this oath. Very useful at the trial. Not historically accurate, but very useful. So we have this sense that there's this 2,000-year history. In fact, well after Hippocratic times, Agrippina, whom some of you may recognize this story, Agrippina married to Claudius, the emperor. This is 350 years after the time of the Hippocratic school. Apparently she and Claudius do not get along all that well, because she ends up hiring Xenophon, who, this is not the Xenophon military history guy, this is Xenophon this is Xenophon the physician. She hires Xenophon to kill him. And there are no critiques on medical ethics grounds leveled against Xenophon that, you know, he broke the oath of all physicians, because there was no oath of all physicians in this era. So some might say that medical professionalism arises with organization of hospitals during the Middle Ages. So you start to see groups and the need for teamwork. That's also a very important thing. Certainly the idea of continuous improvement and humility is lost, however, in the Middle Ages, in the so-called Dark Ages, right? This is a wonderful image because it shows, it's a very famous image, but I think few people notice the most remarkable thing about it, I think, which is 0 of the doctors in this image are looking at the patient, who's, you know, a corpse. But nevertheless, they're supposed to be learning something from this corpse. They are not. They're all looking at the book, at the or they're looking at the painter. But they're looking at the book, which presumably is Vesalius, because Vesalius was a text from the ancients, and the ancients are revered, and God is revered, and the idea that we should do anything that might actually improve upon the ancients is seen as almost heretical. So we in the Western world, by the way, medicine is continuing to advance in the Eastern world and in Africa, but in the Western, Europe, medicine sort of takes a hiatus from improvement for 1,000 years, until the Enlightenment and Thomas Percival, and there are a few others I'm skipping quite a lot here, but Percival. Really interesting guy because he is a physician at the Manchester Infirmary. This is an era in which, the Great London Plague has not been all that far in the past. And he is in an environment where teamwork becomes exceedingly important because it's a pretty large institution. And the doctors in this institution start to quibble and bicker amongst themselves. They enter into what are called flights or pamphlet wars. Flight is spelled F-L-Y-T-E. If you ever want to Google it, it's really interesting. So they get into these pamphlet wars in which one, doctor or cluster of doctors will say, we know how to treat this, and those other doctors are terrible, they'll hurt you, and the other doctors get upset and say, no, they're the ones who will hurt you. Some of these escalate into duels, so literal duels where doctors are killing each other over patient care ideas. And Percival puts together what becomes really the first written code of ethics for his infirmary. This is first edition of this is in 1792. There are a couple additional editions of this. The most famous one is from 1803, which I'll come back to in a second. This is driven by his recognition of the increasingly complex world in which medical practice is taking place, the need for people to be able to work together. He is the one, by the way, this is a teaching hospital. He invents clinical rounds, the idea of rounding with a team of people and having the student present the case, and then the next person up the hierarchy makes some comments, and then the next person up the hierarchy makes some comments. That is still the model of medical education today. He's the one who coins the term medical ethics. He also coins the term professional ethics because he starts the conversation about the tacit compact of the entire group of doctors, the profession, with the community, with the patients that they serve as a collective. He actually tries to get the British Medical Association to adopt his code of ethics, the code that he put together for the Manchester Infirmary. They, however, do not like this idea at all. The British Medical Association turns him down. They essentially say, we don't need a stinking code of ethics. We are gentlemen. Gentlemen know how to behave. And in fact, fascinating quote, what they say in response is essentially, the only people who would make use of a written code of ethics are people who want to pretend to be gentlemen, but who are not. So it would be a cheat book to allow you to act like you had honor, when in fact you did not already have honor. So they turn him down. The idea of a national code of ethics will only take place in the US, which in some ways makes sense because the US is in some senses rejecting the honor, right? The idea of noblesse oblige. The US is seen as a more contractual society, right? It's coming out of the French Revolution, right? So the idea of social contracts is really being implemented in the US. And so it makes sense that in 1847, the American Medical Association at its formation orients itself around standards for education and standards for ethics, because this is what they need in order to create a contract with society. This is not a quote from today. This is a quote from a newspaper editorial at the time of the writing of the AMA's Code of Medical Ethics when it was first promulgated, saying it was as revolutionary a document as the Declaration of Independence. It was such an unusual idea that a whole collective would say, these are our collective promises to you. And this, by the way, almost word for word sections of it come from Percival's 1803 document. So they borrow heavily from Percival and turn this into what is a very explicit social contract, or some people would prefer the word compact because there were no patients at the table to write this contract, right? So it's not exactly a contract. But the idea here is that, and this is the structure of the 1847 AMA Code is fascinating. It's basically 3 chapters. The first chapter is on the physician's responsibility to patients and patient's responsibility to physicians. Reciprocal relationship. Second chapter, I believe, is physicians' responsibilities to their colleagues, again, reciprocal. And third is physicians' responsibilities to the community and the community's promises back to the physicians. Again, there are no community representatives, there are no patient representatives, but this idea is that the entire ethics of medicine is built on reciprocity, give and get, promises and reciprocal promises, rewards in exchange for keeping and enforcing those promises within the group. So this gets to this question of the modern concept of professionalism. I've got a dozen different definitions of professions and professionalism, but I'll just put up the one that I think is the most emblematic of what most people probably think of when they think, what does professionalism mean today? And I'm going to critique this as a concept, because this is what I call the list approach to defining medical professionalism, which is to say, the question here is, what are the things we would like to see in a good doctor and in a good medical profession, in a good nurse, in a good pharmacist, right? This is not limited to doctors by any stretch. And then, writing that down and saying, we want these people to be guided by patient welfare, autonomy, justice. This is the ABIM Medical Professionalism Project definition, and these commitments, right, to competence, to honesty, to managing conflicts of interest, to science, to access to care, to quality improvement, et cetera. These are the things that we think good doctors and good nurses and good pharmacists should promise and live up to. What the list approach misses is the why. Right? Those are important things. I don't want to put them down at all. These are attributes that are important. They are the promises of health professionals. They are the contents of the code of ethics, but they're not why we have a code of ethics. Professionalism is not the set of things we do. It's the reason why we do them. And I'll just back up for a second to make this point very, I hope, obvious. Just think about the etymology of this word. Profess, right? To profess means to speak out, to declare in public, right? When you get married, you profess your devotion and love to your spouse. A professor is someone doing what I'm doing, right? Speaking out. So a profession is a group speaking out together about the shared standards and values that govern their work. So a professional is a member of this group, or if you use professional as an adjective, something is professional if it's in conformance with the profession, with the things that group has professed, right? It's unprofessional if it is out of sync with the professed values and standards of the group. So what does ism add to this word? Well, what are other isms? They're belief systems, right? They're ideologies. Catholicism, capitalism, consumerism, communism. Isms are belief systems about the role of capital in society, or the role of the consumer in society, or the role of, socialism, right? These are all belief systems about the role that this thing plays in the world, or should play in the world. So professionalism is a belief system. It's a belief system that holds that groups of professionals are uniquely well suited to organize and deliver some certain social good. So medical professionalism is the belief that we, medical professionals, ought to establish our own standards and ensure adherence to them. And that society will benefit if that's how healthcare is organized. Right? Now, the sociology of this is complex, but I'm going to boil it down to a couple different schools of thought here. So I'm skipping Max Weber and going straight to Talcott Parsons. But Parsons really crystallized this view of professionalism, and specifically of the medical profession, although he looked at other professions as well, saying that the things that make professions unique all have a specific social function. That's why this is called the structural functionalist school. The structures, the unique structures of professions have these useful social functions. So for example, professions, not just medicine, but others, tend to really take confidentiality very seriously. Why is that? Well, there's a reason, right? If you have a sexually transmitted disease, you need to be able to tell your doctor about that so your doctor can treat you and prevent you from passing it along to others, and society thereby benefits, right? So there are unique things that professions take very seriously that other occupations may not. And here's why. Here's the social benefit. Parsons also saw professions as what he called an interstitial go-between. So they had both responsibilities to individual clients or patients in our case, and to society as a whole. So I'll give you the obvious example here. I am a physician. If you come to me and you want to get out of your airline ticket, I can write you a note and you will probably get a refund on your airline ticket. But you can't just pay me $50 and I'll give you that note. You'd have to pay me a lot more than that. No, right? So we serve society and individuals, right? What's good for the individual is not the only thing on our mind, because we serve this role as an interstitial go-between. This last point is worth harping on for just a minute, because this is, Parsons is writing in the 20s and 30s. So this is the same time that Adam Smith is writing. And so it's not the case that he is not confronted with the question of, wait a minute, why not the invisible hand of the marketplace? Why wouldn't doctors just do what's best for them? Right? Why would doctors not be self-interested primarily? And so he had to grapple with this question, and his answer is fascinating. He says, well, doctors do look out for their own self-interest first. The thing is, people who go into the professions are psychologically distinguished by the fact that what they value the most is not money. What they value the most is looking good in front of their peers. This is what drives professionals. They want to look good in front of their peers. And that's who goes into the professions. And I love that you all chuckled at that, because it does seem a little quaint today. And that's because of this, sort of countervailing school of thought, which is still very active today, which is the critical power theorists. And the emblematic person here is Elliot Friedson. Friedson comes along at a time where we are starting to see research, including some very terrific research done just across the street here, looking at things like, do doctors who own their own X-ray machine take a hell of a lot more X-rays? And the answer is yes, they do. What if you send 100 children to ENT surgeons to see how many of them ought to get their tonsils out? And it turns out 30% of them need to get their tonsils out. And then you take the 70 remaining children and send them to different ENT surgeons. And it turns out of those 70, 30% need to get their tonsils out. That kind of research really harms trust in the medical profession as putting patients and social interests first. And it starts to look like maybe, as Friedson put it, professional privileges are prerogatives that have been won by making promises that maybe we weren't really committed to keeping. And this is the era in which we start to see, Supreme Court cases coming up, starting to claw back some of the privileges that had been given to the medical profession around self-regulation, around setting our own prices, right? Those kinds of privileges are going to be taken back when you start to question whether we are managing our authority appropriately. This gets to the thing that Friedson contributed that has helped me the most, which is to think about, okay, so if you don't think professionalism is a good way to organize the healthcare system, what are your alternatives? And there are alternatives, right? There are three what he calls ideal types, three ideologies that can be used to organize and deliver medical care. The market. Right? In the marketplace, quality assurance is through the idea of the invisible hand, right? People will compete. And if one person is delivering, think about it as a pizza parlor, right? Two pizza parlors, one has lower quality pizza or higher price. The other has better quality pizza, lower price. People are going to go here. They're not going to go here. And that's going to drive improvement across the whole system, right? So competition is what drives improvement. Transparency is the ethics of the marketplace. I know some people say markets have no ethics, but they do, right? An ethical marketplace is one in which you have full information and you have knowledge of your wants, needs, and desires and your willingness to pay. And that's what drives, resource allocation. Healthcare in this is what economists would call a normal good, like toothpaste or car tires or computers, any number of other things. It's a good like any other, right? The state is also a possible way to think about this, right? Statism, in which case you think of healthcare as a common good. If healthcare is a common good, like the environment or roads and bridges or national defense, if you think of healthcare as a common good, then maybe you think state regulation governed by an ethics of equity, right, to optimize social benefit, ensure everyone has access to the same thing. Now, I will say, by the way, because everyone here must be thinking, these things don't actually play out this way in the real world, right? And they don't, just as professionalism doesn't play out the way we promised it to in the real world. So the consequence of this, and I'll just say, we've already talked about professionalism. So collegial self-regulation, that's what's supposed to drive QI. Fiduciary obligations are the fundamental ethics. These reciprocal responsibilities to colleagues and to the community and to patients. We're supposed to be working at this interstitium, right, between individual and social needs and an ethics of service. So this is how you see healthcare. The arguments for professionalism were pretty compelling, right? The arguments for professionalism, even 100 years ago when we did not have that much to offer, but by the way, we thought we did. There was no shortage of hubris in the era of heroic medicine, right? If you go back and read what people were writing in the 1830s and 40s, they thought they were pretty brilliant. We thought, and we argued, that patients are vulnerable. And they are vulnerable both to the state and to the marketplace. And so they need us. And that's true of other professions as well. Professions arise around people in positions of vulnerability, whether it's in the education system or in their moment of spiritual crisis, et cetera. We also argued that civilizations are judged on how they care for their most vulnerable people. and that a good civilization needs a community of practice that arises around the care of these vulnerable people. And we can point now to many instances where the profession has fallen down, and the profession of medicine specifically, Stephen Biko and the South African Medical Association, right? The Soviet Union and psychiatry, misuse of psychiatry, the obvious example of the Nazi physicians. Right, there are examples where physicians have clearly failed to protect the more vulnerable communities that they're entrusted to their service, and we judge those communities harshly. The American experience is to be judged as well. And we said this is technically complex, rapidly evolving work. There's no way regulation can keep up with this. And there's no way that a marketplace will work because patients are not able to learn everything they would need to be able to learn in order to really discern the options in front of them. So we made these good arguments for why professionalism ought to be where we entrust the delivery of our healthcare. But the reality, as I said, is that that's not how it plays out at the state level, is a regulatory level. It's not how it plays out at the consumerism level, and it's not how it plays out at the professional level. And so we end up having to balance all of these. And the reality of every medical system in the world, there are no healthcare systems that are purely state delivered. There are none that are purely market delivered. We've made the argument, I and others, that in the US, we've been so wrapped up in the conversation about whether we ought to have a state-delivered healthcare system or a market-delivered healthcare system that we've forgotten that professionalism is a key balancing force, potentially, in that triangle. But we have to have some of each of these. This is a fascinating quote from a book that Elliot Friedson wrote at the end of his career, called Professionalism Reborn. So this is the guy who was the strongest critic of the concept of professionalism. I have to think this is towards the end of career, and he may have started having interactions in the healthcare system as a patient. And he starts to think, healthcare is complex, and I want it attuned to me, not to, a regulatory system. And so he starts to see some of the value of professionalism as a way to organize and deliver healthcare. But this raises, the failures of professionalism, which were manifest and are manifest today as a way of organizing and delivering care, right? So this goes all the way back to the very beginning. If you look at the early years of the AMA, there are all these committees set up that set these standards for medical care delivery. And then at the same time, they're saying there is no tribunal other than the physician's own conscience to adjudge penalties for carelessness or neglect. So we're going to set standards, but we are not going to enforce them. This is my example of this from Pirates of the Caribbean, which, pardon the pirate voice, the code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules. This balancing act, right, is what we have struggled with within the medical profession for 200 years now. So there is a desire for us to make medicine amenable to complete, control and management and regulation. And at the same time, we want individual doctors to have the authority to deviate, to, do what's right for that one person in that one circumstance. And our willingness to start thinking about this in more scientific terms, to start thinking about what should the practice be, is a part of the scientificization, if that's a word, the evolution of evidence-based medical practice, the idea that we would do randomized trials. This is all, a part of the same tree. Thinking of medicine as something that we as a group can improve over time. And it works, right? It works. We see enormous success by making medicine less art and more science. We also become increasingly arrogant. Arrogance is probably not what Rabbi Adels is referring to here, but I think it's nevertheless the case that if a patient dies, the soul of the physician is at risk. That's probably what he's talking about. But if you save someone, that also puts your soul at risk in a different way. This heroic success brings us the apex of professionalism as the way to deliver medical care in the US, right? The American medical field becomes entrusted with unquestioned professional closure. So this is the idea that you can't just hang up a shingle and call yourself a doctor. That is actually illegal. So state and profession are now working together to enforce the profession's authority over the entire field, right? We have unquestioned closure, and that leads to this loss of customer service orientation. It leads to, or is concurrent with, rising paternalism and loss of humility. Go all the way back to the Hippocratics here. It leads to a neglect of civic obligations, especially after World War II and the Nuremberg trial, and the widespread belief that what happened there was that doctors lost their attunement to the care of individual patients and instead became agents of the state, right? And there's truth to that. But that leads doctors in the US to go in a completely, to really turn the other way towards this idea of professional autonomy and what I will call an oversimplified version of medical professionalism, which is to just pay attention to the one person sitting in front of you. This debate over what professional autonomy means is ongoing today. Does professional autonomy mean the right of the profession as a whole to set and enforce practice standards? That's what it originally meant. Or does it today mean the right of an individual doctor to practice as they please? Having passed the boards, off you go, right? And this question of the extent to which we as a group govern the values, the beliefs, the behaviors, the actions, et cetera, is medicine a priesthood? Are you relinquishing your personal autonomy, your individual liberty to some extent when you enter this field? We went through about a 40-year period where the idea of what is good medical ethics was very, very focused, and this idea of zealous advocacy came to the fore. I gave the quote from Norm Levinsky here, but I think you could find many, many other similar quotes from this time frame in the 70s and the 80s especially. The problem with that is that it misses the original understanding, and this simplified sort of lawyerly version of medical professionalism requires that we set up systems and structures that none of us like, right? If you're going to be the zealous advocate for the one person sitting in front of you, that means you're going to have a zealous advocate on the other side and a judge, right? That's why it works in the law. Zealous advocacy works in the law because the advocate is not also the judge and the jury. But in medicine, we want to be the judge and the jury and the advocate. So the result of that easy reframing, the simplified reframing of what it means to be a professional, is out of control spending in the healthcare system, erosion of public trust because people start seeing us as skimming a lot off the top of that out of control spending, weakening of professional closure, as I already mentioned, and increased competition, which leads us within the profession to start to think less about setting and enforcing rules and more about serving as advocates for each other, right? So our professional associations start to really turn away from quality improvement and standard setting and towards trade advocacy. That makes us increasingly unable to deliver on our promise of self-regulation. And in some ways, professionalism turns into, as it in some ways has in the US, turns into a set of structures for enforcing social and class norms that are at their root misogynistic, racist, right? We start to see professionalism as a cudgel for social conformity rather than as an obligation for social responsibility. To just wrap this up, I don't want to end on such a low note. So I will say that I think in the last decade, 15 years, we have started to come out of this and see professionalism in this more robust, complex, and challenging way, which is that every generation gets to redefine what it means to play this role in society and with your patients. Every generation gets to have this conversation about what does being a nurse, a doctor, a pharmacist mean, right? We are constantly reframing and revising and relooking at these things and figuring out what are the core things and what needs to evolve. So this is what professionalism requires, is constant conversation about what it means and what are we willing to enforce amongst ourselves, and what are we willing to stand up for, and what are we willing to compromise on, because we are working, after all, in a society where the state does play a role, where patients play roles, consumerism plays a role, right? So if the state decides that they want to do some kind of a regulatory move on medical practice, that is not per se illegitimate. But if it's in direct conflict with a core professional value, then we have this responsibility to press back on that, right? So that conversation is critically important, and it raises the question of how do we have that conversation today? Where does that conversation take place? How do we come together as a community and establish and then enforce and promulgate our professional values and responsibilities? And this gets me to, last point, which I admit is fairly overtly a political point. But I love this quote from Osler, who was once asked by a medical student, should I go to the medical society meeting tonight? What am I going to get out of it? Well, what will I learn? And he replied, do you think I go for what I can get out of it or what I can put into it? Which is very reminiscent of the Kennedy quote from decades later. But this is the responsibility of being a member of this profession. It's to be engaged in the conversations that we're going to engage in today, right? And I'll close with this quote from Plato, just because I love it, and we're getting very close. Some of us, including in Colorado, can vote as of this week. So remember that the punishment of wise people who refuse to participate in the affairs of government is to live under the rule of unwise people. I'll stop there. Hope I've got a few minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Matt, for that lecture starting us off today. I know that we have some time for questions, and we'll also be taking some questions from our virtual participants from our chat box. Thank you to our Associate Director, Ed Hundert, who's monitoring the online chat box along with Genevieve. I believe that we were going to bring around some microphones so that everyone online can hear. If anybody has any questions, I can also facilitate doing that. Yes.
Maybe perhaps I have a myopic view. But one of the slides, you made a comment that if the patient doesn't do well, the soul of the clinician is going to be affected. But you also said that if we save a patient, it will be affected then too. What were you thinking when you were saying that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I hope, was everyone online able to hear that? I just want to make sure. So what I was referring to there is that arrogance is a significant risk when you find that, you are ascribed, when you are associated with these, tremendous successes. And I think it is a risk for all of us, both, certainly I was making a point about it being a risk for the profession as a whole, for the organizations within the profession, that we start to feel like, aren't we the best? But I think it's also possible at the individual level. I know I have, walked home from a day of work thinking pretty highly of myself in the past.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So that was Dr. Renu Goyal, who's actually the current chair of the Massachusetts Medical Society Ethics Committee. So an apt question and a practicing internist. Okay. So I'm going to go to David Sontag, who's Deputy General Counsel of Beth Israel Lahey and an ethics co-lead in that institution for the next question.
So given the growing institutionalization of medicine, how do you see that playing out as their role with consumer, state, professional, and now you've got the institution as a major player?
Yeah, that is such a great question, because it is there's a possible future in which institutions start to play the role that the medical societies have played in the past, right? That medical staff become the structure in which this kind of social contract gets ironed out. I think that's a possibility. It would be less than ideal in the sense that then you're talking about, MGH having one set and, the University of Colorado health system having a different social contract. And again, you could imagine that happening because, and maybe, to some extent it should, in that we are a confederated, United States of America, and local things, ought to be taken care of locally. And that sort of idea is quite strong and strongly held in the US. So you could imagine, breaking this down to even a very hyper local level and saying, well, within our community, and this also gets to the blending of market and profession, right? So if you think each institution ought to have its own code of ethics and its own social agreements with the communities that they serve, you could say, well, okay, so there's a reason to have that be hyper local. I say I would not prefer that personally. And I think professionally, we ought not to prefer that. I think we are better served, and the community is better served when we have some level of national, if not international, agreement on what the social roles of medicine are and how they intersect with the responsibilities at the level of individual patients. I'll give one quick story about this from Arthur Applebaum, who's here across the river. But Applebaum wrote a wonderful book called Ethics for Adversaries. It's, 20 years old now, but there are so many great chapters in this book. But one of them is called Dr. Schmachter. And Dr. Schmachter is an argument for and against the idea that what it means to be a doctor is socially constructed. And any group of doctors in a community can decide what it means to be a doctor in that community. And you could have, and as long as you're open and transparent about that, why isn't that okay? Right? So why couldn't you have, within the way he frames this, within a country, you could have some people who are doctors and they hold traditional medical ethics as we know it today. And you could have another group, and as long as they call themselves schmockers and say, you know, I'm not a doctor. My ethics, I have the same technical skills, but my ethics are that I am looking out for the well-being primarily of the institution that I serve. And you are a secondary concern. Obviously, I'm not going to kill you, but you're my secondary concern. My primary concern is to the well-being of the institution. And as long as you're open and honest about that, maybe that's fine. And the lesson for me about that, from that chapter, was not, okay, that's fine. It was, oh my gosh, you're right. If we're honest about it, that could happen. We get to decide though, right? Whether that happens.
Okay, I'm going to
Sorry,
take.
that was too long, wasn't it?
No, that was great. We have time and we are here to hear from you. So our next question comes from our colleague, Bill Kettle, who is joining us online. Hi, Bill. Bill asks, we are increasingly asked to evaluate medical students on their professionalism. Do you have any comments on this endeavor? I'm guessing maybe one or two.
Yeah, that's, again, absolutely fantastic question, and a whole, certainly another hour on evaluating professionalism. There are books written about this. David Stern has a great book on this. The challenge that I see is that when we try to make this measurable, what we have done is turned to the things that are easy to measure, right? So this is the lamppost problem. You all are familiar with the, you know, looking for the keys in the dark, and why are you looking there? It's because where the light is, right? That joke. So we have turned that is one of the instances where we have turned professionalism into this cudgel for social conformity around norms that are relatively easy to assess. So we see, you know, people arguing about whether you should be able to wear your hair a certain way, or your, you know, fingernails ought to have nail polish on them, or whether you can have yourself in a bikini on the beach, or, you know, drinking a beer after hours, all of those kinds of things, which I don't want to denigrate them, because I actually think those are all useful conversations to have, but they are not the core features of the medical profession. And if you're looking at the core features, the things we ought to be measuring, it would be things like, are you engaged in, you know, quality improvement? Are you, you know, capable of speaking up? Do you have the skills, and have we created the environment in which you can speak up if you're worried about a safety issue, right? Those are the kinds of things, and they get perilously close to, you know, what kind of environment have we created that foster your professionalism, that foster your ability to serve this, you know, important role as a patient advocate and as a protector of social norms and values as well. Those things are a little bit more challenging for me to assess on rounds with an individual patient or with an individual student. And I'm kind of evaluating myself as well as I'm evaluating the student if I'm doing this right. Because professionalism is about the creation of the whole, right? It's not just you as an individual. So there's a sense in which the way we measure professionalism at the level of students is wrong at it's wrong conceptually, right? It's not really understanding what professionalism means. We are measuring professional or unprofessional behaviors, and that's important, but it's not what professionalism is. So we're not measuring the strength of the professional climate, right? And that's where I think we would be much better served as a whole, is to be thinking about how would we measure whether this organization is creating an environment in which professionalism is supported.
Great, thanks. We're going to go next to Dr. Reed.
Thank you for this. I'm struck by several things. This concept of professionalism, and how one defines himself in the past as a gentleman. I'm struck, and the inclusion and exclusion that's included in that.
Yes.
Struck by the concept of AMA and code of ethics in an organization that was founded with absolute exclusion as part of it. And I think about where we are today and really question this concept of professionalism in the face of exclusion and inclusion. And to what extent can you have a true focus on this sort of collective of how professionals, individuals come together with patience and to protect society, and at the same time determine who can be in the profession, and what that says about the values. Can you truly value all individuals? If you say, I value you when you're a patient, but I don't value you when it comes to being a student or a colleague.
Yeah, there's so much in there. So two just reflections, because I don't have a complete answer to that observation. One is I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates speak with Ezra Klein. I don't know how many people listen to the Ezra Klein podcast, but fantastic. And one of the questions that they talked about was, when did the US become a democracy? At what year would you say the US actually became a democracy? Or is it today, right? That is, which I thought was a fantastic way to frame that conversation about like this ideal that we have put out there for generations, but which we so clearly were not living up to for many of those, most of those generations, honestly, right? Until fairly recently, you could make a very strong case that we were not a democracy because large swaths of the country were being completely excluded from the process. Again, you could argue that even today, I suppose, but I thought that was fascinating, and it bears on this conversation about, so when did professionalism actually start to happen, if ever, in the American medical community, right? When was that ideal actually lived up to, if it ever has been? And the second, so that's observation number one. Observation number two is I currently co-chair the AMA's Truth, Reconciliation, Healing, and Transformation work. And so we were in Montgomery a couple months ago, and I was back in Montgomery and Tuskegee just 10 days ago. And I will say, this question of how do you recover from that kind of a history and get on a better footing to move forward is a very live one within the organizations of the American medical profession today. What is it, how do you acknowledge that history? Right, years ago, a decade ago, more than a decade ago, we did work about the exclusion of Black doctors from the AMA. I led this, 4-year-long project on the history of AMA exclusionary practices. And the AMA apologized, to big public apology to the National Medical Association, and has been working closely with the NMA since then on a number of things, including this Truth and Reconciliation work, where I should acknowledge my co-chair is Dr. Neva Lubin-Johnson from the National Medical Association. And I am still digging on this. Like, how do you recover from that history? What does reconciliation mean? Right, the reparations isn't even really the beginning of that conversation. And if we didn't have the AMA, and we didn't have that as a forum for having these difficult conversations, I think we would have to create something like it, right? We would have to recreate a forum where all the specialties and the states and, where we could bring people around that table to have that conversation about what does the future look like, acknowledging where we stand right now and how we got to where we are. How do we use that knowledge of the past, of history, to move forward in the spirit of, you know, the famous Faulkner quote about the past is never dead. It isn't even past. Right? We live in this past and we are writing the future. Right? So that's the other side of that coin is we're not stuck in that past. We get to write the next chapter. What's it going to be?
Great, thank you so much. I know in the spirit of wonderful lectures, the questions are just now really starting to come in and you've given us so much to think about. A couple of things that we might think about, I want to bring in from the online questions. These are questions that will bring us forward rather than to have answers. From our colleague, Dr. Tim Leahy in Vermont, in my more utilitarian moments, I worry ethicist emphasis on lofty values to which unpoliced physicians only partially adhere may distract from the formation of incentives for physicians that are better aligned to patient and population needs. Thoughts on how to strike the right balance between patients and populations, something for us to continue to think about. And then finally, from our colleague Griffin Jones, physicians speaking out in the last 10 years politically or as advocates for public causes have been chastised to, quote, stay in their lane. Beyond arguments about which matters are health related or not, how do we think about an interpretation from the perspective of professionalism? Some really easy questions with very simple answers. And I think that the greatest sign of learning together is that we end with bigger and even more pressing questions perhaps than we started with. And in that vein, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Matt Wynia for a wonderful lecture.